Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Wiener Holocaust Library online event held as part of the event series for our Traces of Belsen exhibition. I'm Barbara Warnock, the Senior Curator and Head of Education at the Wiener Holocaust Library. In case anybody isn't from the UK, just to say that we're based in London. We're near the British Museum, we're on Russell Square, and that our exhibition Traces of Belsen is running until July. And so if you are able to come in person and see the exhibition, it would be great to welcome you at Russell Square. We're open Monday to Friday. So I'm really delighted tonight that as part of our event series, Goldie Morgentaler has agreed to give us this talk, and she's going to be focusing in her talk on the life of her mother, Chava Rosenfarb, and you can see that we've already got a photograph of Chava up for you. Goldie will be talking about her mother's life and work, and then there'll be a chance for questions at the end. And so if you could place any of your questions in the chat, we'll be able to have a look at them later on. So Goldie Morgentaler is Professor Emerita at the University of Lethbridge, where she taught 19th century British literature and modern Jewish literature. She is the translator from Yiddish to English of much of Chava Rosenfarb's work, including Rosenfarb's epic Holocaust novel, The Tree of Life, a Trilogy of Life in the Łódź Ghetto. She is the editor and one of the translators of a collection of Rosenfarb's essays called Confessions of a Yiddish Writer and Other Essays. And this collection won a 2019 Canadian Jewish Literary Award and a 2020 Segal Award. Her translations of Chava Rosenfarb's fiction and non-fiction have also won the Modern Language Association's Memorial Prize in Yiddish Studies. In 2024, she received a Canadian Jewish Literary Award for her translation of Rosenfarb's short story collection, In the Land of the Postscript. She is also the editor of a forthcoming book of letters called Letters from the Afterlife, the Post-Holocaust Correspondence of Chava Rosenfarb and Xenia Larson. So I'll hand over now to Goldie to start her talk. So welcome, Goldie.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you. I want to thank the Wiener Holocaust Library for inviting me to speak today in conjunction with their exhibit on Bergen Belsen. It's a great honor to be part of the events surrounding this exhibit, especially since I have a personal connection to that horrific camp and its history through my family. On April 15th, 1945, my mother, Chava Rosenfarb, my grandmother, and my aunt were liberated at Bergen Belsen by the British Army. Liberated along with them was Chava's best friend from Łódź, Żenia Marcinkowska, and her stepmother. And I'll have more to say about Żenia at the end of my talk. On the day she was liberated, Chava did not know that she was free because she was suffering from typhus. The British transported her to a hospital nearby, and there she slowly recovered. While convalescing, Chava and her family stayed on at the newly established Bergen Belsen DP camp that the British had constructed in old army barracks not far from the original camp, which they burned. It was also from Bergen Belsen DP camp that my mother set out with her younger sister, Henya, to look for their father. They wandered all over the roads of bombed-out Germany, looking for him, traveling from place to place by hitching rides on lorries. It was a fruitless search. When the two young women returned to Bergen Belsen DP camp, they learned that their father had been killed, ironically, not by the Germans, but by the Americans, who had bombed the train that he and other camp inmates were riding as the Germans tried to hide their crimes by moving their prisoners deeper into Germany. The person who brought Chava the news of her father's death was a former Dachau inmate himself, who had been with her father at Kaufering, a subcamp of Dachau. and was on that same bombed train. This young man's name was Henrik, later changed to Henry Morgentaler. He had been Chava's boyfriend before the war, and he would eventually become my father. My parents would marry in Brussels 4 years later on the eve of immigrating to Canada. These are some of the stories that my mother told me about Bergen Belsen, and these stories I know directly from her. In an odd way, they are my Yerusha, my inheritance, the emotional food that I was raised on, although I was born several years after the end of the war. But there are other stories, some of them quite horrific, that I only learned about from translating Chava's last novel, Letters to a Brasha, which I'm sorry to say is not finished yet. The last sections of this novel are set in Bergen Belsen. But let me return to my mother, Chava, whom you see here in the first photo that she had taken after the war. I assume that many of you listening tonight will not know who she was, nor what she did to warrant your attention. Chava was 22 years old when she was liberated at Bergen Belsen, so still a young woman with most of her life ahead of her. She spent much of that life writing, primarily in Yiddish, the language of her lost community of Lodz Jews. She died in 2011 in Lethbridge, Alberta, at the age of 88. Chava Rosenfarb was a writer of the past, of her own past, and that of the Jews of Poland. For her, the past meant specifically Jewish, Yiddish-speaking Poland, the Poland that she saw disappear before her eyes during the 4 long years that she spent imprisoned in the Lodz Ghetto, and the final year that she spent in the concentration camps Auschwitz, Segal, and Bergen Belsen. She was a writer with a mission. That mission was to recreate the lost world of Polish Jewry in her novels, to chronicle and memorialize a community that no longer existed because it had been annihilated. All of Chava's long fiction deals with the Holocaust in one way or another. 3 of her novels, The Tree of Life, Bochani, and Letters to a Brasha, are set in Poland, the country of her birth, and specifically in the city of Łódź. In contrast, her short stories deal with the afterlives of Holocaust survivors who settled, like Chava herself, in Montreal after the war. Since Chava wrote a great deal, short stories, essays, poetry, and the 3 novels I just mentioned, I can only give you a brief taste of her work in this lecture, but I hope it will be enough to whet your appetite to know more and to read her work for yourselves, much of which is now available in English. As I said, Chava was born in Łódź in 1923, the elder of 2 daughters of Abraham Rosenfarb, a restaurant waiter. Łódź was at the time the 2nd largest city in Poland after Warsaw. Chava's mother worked in a textile factory as a stoperke, which means a mender of faults in fabric. Both of Chava's parents originally came from a small town called Końsk near Krakow. So here's Łódź, and I think Końsk is somewhere here. The father's side of the family traced its descent from Reb Yonason Eibushitz, a famous rabbi who had opposed the false messiah Shabtai Tzvi in the 17th century, while secretly being one of his followers. Chava was very proud of the fact that she descended from a famous rabbi because it gave her yichus. And like a true writer, she loved the ambivalence of not knowing which side of the Shabtai Tzvi controversy he was on. Chava's parents both migrated from the town of Koinsk to Łódź to find work in the factories of that great industrial city. There they married, and Chava and her younger sister Henya were both born in Łódź. Her father began his working life as a weaver in a factory, but because he was an unusually good-looking man, or so my mother said, he landed a job as a waiter in a restaurant that catered to a literary and political clientele. And this was his job when Chava, his first child, was born. She later published a fictional account of the early lives and courtship of both her parents in the novels Bochani and Of Łódź and Love. And both of these novels have just been reissued in paperback. Chava's parents were active in the Jewish Socialist Bund, the secular left-leaning Jewish political movement that had an enormous following among working-class Jews in Eastern Europe. In the period between the two world wars, the Bund was a major cultural and political force in Poland, where it elected representatives to the city council in the larger cities. Bundist ideology encouraged agitation for equal rights for Jews in Poland, where there was rampant anti-Semitism, with restrictions on Jews in higher education and the professions. The Bund also incorporated a strong cultural element that privileged Yiddish as the language of the Jewish masses. So Chava and her sister were educated in Yiddish at a Bundist school. One of the other students at the school was Heinrich Morgentaler, the son of Joseph Morgentaler, a Bundist representative to the city council of Łódź. Chava married Heinrich Morgentaler, as I've already mentioned, right after the war in 1949 in Belgium. When they emigrated to Canada, he changed his name to Henry and became famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, in Canada as a crusader for abortion rights. Even as a child, Chava had shown a talent for writing. She produced countless poems, which her father proudly showed off to the patrons of the restaurant where he worked. She later claimed that she became a writer on the day that she first learned to hold a pencil in her hand. But she became a Holocaust writer on February 8, 1940, one day before her 17th birthday, when she, her family, and the entire Jewish population of Łódź were herded into a ghetto. There she wrote, "The nightmare of my early years began in earnest." And it is this nightmare of living for 4 years behind the barbed wire of the Lodz Ghetto that became the subject of her epic 3-volume novel, The Tree of Life. The Nazis established the ghetto in 1940, herding the Jews into one of the city's slums called Baluti, which they encircled with barbed wire. Chava's family was housed in a tiny apartment with only a kitchen and a bedroom. She and her sister slept in the kitchen on chairs and a sofa. It was from this bed of chairs that she would rise every morning at dawn to write poems before going to work at her various ghetto jobs. And this is a photo of the iconic wooden bridge that connected the two sides of the Lodz Ghetto. And underneath, as you can see, is the city itself with business going on as usual and trams circulating. And this is a photo of Lodz Ghetto Jews. When the Lodz Ghetto was liquidated in August 1944, Chava and her family were deported to Auschwitz, where she was separated from her father, whom she never saw again. From Auschwitz, Chava, her mother, and sister were transported to the forced labor camp at Zazo on the outskirts of Hamburg, where they built houses for the bombed-out Germans of that city. As the Allies approached, Chava, her mother, and sister were again transported, this time to Bergen Belsen, where they were liberated by the British Army in April 1945. In 1950, she immigrated to Canada and settled in Montreal. Given her experiences during the war, it's not surprising that the Holocaust hovers over Chava's work like a malignant shadow. In fact, the genesis of her most famous novel, The Tree of Life, began at Auschwitz, and this is Chava's description. When we disembarked at Auschwitz, I stood on the station platform with my knapsack on my back, one arm embracing my father. I held a bundle of poems that I had written in the ghetto under the other arm. A capo tore the bundle from under my arm and tossed it onto a heap of discarded prayer books, letters, and photographs. The men were separated from the women, and my father was ordered to join the columns of men. That was the last I ever saw of him. Then came the selection. My mother, my sister, and I were sent off through the gate with the inscription, Arbeit macht frei. Soon I stood naked with my head shaved, but my life spared. It was then that the thought of one day writing a book about the Lodz Ghetto, that is, if I survived, flickered for a moment across my mind. And that's the end of the quotation. In fact, it was not until Chava was settled in Brussels immediately after the war that the real work on the novel began. At the same time, she was writing poetry, and her first published books were collections of poems. Between 1947 and 1965, she published 4 volumes of poetry in Yiddish, and this is the first one. She also wrote a play called The Bird of the Ghetto about the Vilna ghetto hero Isaac Wittenberg. But feeling that neither poetry nor drama could adequately express everything she wanted to say about her experiences during the Holocaust, beginning in the early 1950s, Chava began concentrating most of her literary energies on writing the 3-volume novel, The Tree of Life, which was finally published in Yiddish in 1972. So if you permit, I would like to say a few words about this book, as well as about some of Chava's other books. The Tree of Life is a massive 3-volume work that chronicles the annihilation of the Jews of Łódź. Because the subject is so vast, the structure of the novel, its breadth and scope are vast as well. The Tree of Life is in fact an epic, a chronicle of the destruction of the second largest Jewish community in Poland and in Europe before the war, numbering over 230,000 souls. Only Warsaw had more Jews. That this community was also intimately known to the author, who had been one of its members, lends both an urgency and an authenticity to the novel. The Tree of Life presents in unflinching, precise, and often horrific detail the inner workings of the ghetto, the daily frustrations and humiliations of ghetto life. It chronicles the barbarous cruelty of the Nazis, the constant hunger of the inhabitants, barely relieved by concoctions made from turnips and potato peels. It chronicles torture, betrayal, and degradation. But it also documents the tenderness of human love despite these conditions. It illuminates the complexities of relationships between husbands and wives, parents and children, lovers and friends. It documents the political life of the ghetto, and it describes the cultural life of the ghetto, the establishment of a library in a two-room flat, attendance at concerts and plays, meetings of the writers' group, political agitation and resistance. Most importantly, it peoples the ghetto with complex human beings whose individual stories make for compelling reading. In short, the Tree of Life provides as complete and authentic a portrait of what it was like to have lived and died in the Lodz Ghetto as literature can. And in this way, it also demonstrates the extent to which fiction can both transcend and animate history. If you want to know what life was like in the Lodz Ghetto from 1940 to 1944, then you should read The Tree of Life. It took Chava 22 years to write The Tree of Life, which she began shortly after settling in Montreal in 1950. By that time, she was already a well-known poet in Yiddish language literary circles. Chava spent 50 years of her life in Montreal, a city where Yiddish had once been the most widely spoken language after French and English. And it's a beautiful city too, as you can see. There she continued to write in Yiddish, the language in which she published two more novels, Pochani and Letters to Abrasha. She was also a frequent contributor to Avrum Sutzkever's prestigious Yiddish language literary journal, Die Goldene Kite, where in the early 1980s, she began publishing a series of short stories about the lives of Holocaust survivors in Canada. These stories have been recently published in a collection called In the Land of the Postscript, and that is a publication of the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst. The publisher is White Goat Press, which is an imprint of Yiddish Book Center. Unlike her novels, which are massive in scale and set solely in Poland before and during the Second World War, the short stories are set among the survivor community in Canada in the 1960s and 70s. The most complex of these stories is Edja's Revenge, which addresses the theme of the persistence of Europe and European memories within the context of a new beginning in Canada. It is also unusual in featuring a former capo as the narrator and one of the main characters. As I assume everyone knows, the capos were mostly Jewish concentration camp inmates whom the Nazis put in charge of their fellow prisoners. I don't know of any other literary work that deals sympathetically or at length with the topic of the capos. And if anyone knows, I would please let me know, send me an email. In this story, Edja's Revenge, Rilla, the narrator, had become a capo through bestowing sexual favors on a guard. She lorded it over the other women in her barracks, beating them and indulging in the petty cruelties that her position permitted. Her one good deed was to save the life of Edja, another camp inmate, by hiding Edja under a bunk during roll call. After the war, Rella and Edja meet again in Montreal, where each has settled unbeknownst to the other. The story Edja's Revenge chronicles their desperate attempts to come to terms with their past and with each other. Ambivalence about their European roots haunts all the characters in Edja's Revenge, who as a group lead dual lives. This is also true of all the characters in these stories of Holocaust survivors. Outwardly, they adapt very well to their Canadian reality, learning English or French, making a success of their various business enterprises, participating in the cultural life of their city. But inwardly, as the author makes clear, they have never left the Europe that tortured and rejected them. The truth was, writes Sprella, that we felt alien in this new world, that we were so caught up with modern life because we found it so frightening. When Chava died in 2011, she left behind a lot of work untranslated into English, including the novel Letters to Abrasha, the Bergen Belsen diary, and many letters, some to and from her best friend, Zhenya Marcinkowska in Sweden. The Bergen Belsen diary, which is available online, tablet in the online journal tablet, and in the essay collection Confessions of a Yiddish Writer, recounts the days that Chava, her mother and sister spent in the displaced persons camp at Bergen Belsen right after their liberation. The diary was appended to Chava's very first publication, the poetry collection Die Ballade von Nächtigen Wald, the Ballad of Yesterday's Forest. While the diary was based on a diary that Chava actually kept after her liberation from Bergen Belsen, she had edited and changed it, and changed also the order of certain things. One of the things she edited out before its publication was her relationship with a British soldier named Douglas Jensen, who had been with the British Army that liberated Bergen Belsen concentration camp. They had met at a Yiddish language concert held on the grounds of Bergen Belsen DP camp shortly after the liberation in 1945. Just before the start of that concert, Chava noticed a British soldier sitting in the row in front of her, and she guessed that he was not Jewish. Afraid that he would not understand what was being said, because everything was going to be in Yiddish, she tapped him on the shoulder and offered her services as a translator. Where my mother learned enough English to undertake this potentially fraught endeavor, I have no idea. She certainly never studied English in school, but her translations must have been successful, helped, I'm sure, by her personal attractiveness. As you may have noticed, she was quite a beautiful young woman, because she and the soldier became friends. In fact, they became friends for life. Chava sent Douglas copies of all her published work, despite the fact that she knew he could not read Yiddish. He even accompanied her to a reading of her poetry, the first that she ever gave. This reading took place in March 1949 in London and was organized by her publisher, the poet Moshe Ovid. Moshe Ovid, some of you may have heard of him. He was the owner of an unusual jewelry shop in Bloomsbury called Cameo Corner, and I have some of his rings. He was also very involved with Yiddish and with Jewish cultural life in London. What Douglas made of this event is hard to know, since he did not speak a word of Yiddish. and could not have understood the poems nor what was being said. When Chava sent Douglas the Bergen Belsen diary, he placed an ad in the British press looking for a translator of the text into English. He found one, but this was clearly someone who knew Yiddish a lot better than she knew English. I found this translation among my mother's papers after her death, and I realized immediately that the English text was useless. So I decided to translate the diary myself. And it was this translation that Tablet magazine published on Holocaust Memorial Day, 2014. Having now had some success with publishing Chava's nonfiction work in English, I conceived of the idea of a collection of essays. That was the genesis of Confessions of a Yiddish Writer, a book of Chava's collected essays published in 2019. This essay collection actually represents only a portion of the many essays and reviews that Chava contributed to a variety of Yiddish publications, not to mention the numerous lectures she gave in New York and at the Jewish Public Library in Montreal, as well as elsewhere. I would like to pause on one essay in particular. This is the essay on feminism in Yiddish literature. The essay was written around 1990, when feminism was very much in the news as a newly in the zeitgeist. But it had not yet been applied to Yiddish literature in any kind of systematic way. The reason that such a perspective had taken so long to take hold in the field of Yiddish studies is alluded to in the essay, namely that given the endangered state of Jews in Eastern Europe, the pogroms, persecutions, and everyday slights and abuses, certainly in the early years, Yiddish literary women always felt uncomfortable complaining too much about being relegated to the second rank of literary achievement, of having their talents overlooked or patronized. It seemed like an unwarranted indulgence to insist on equal treatment when the greater danger of violence hovered over all Jews, and later when Yiddish literature itself faced oblivion. Although Chava really never called herself a feminist, she was always very sympathetic to the movement, and she was particularly aware of the kinds of problems women writers encountered, especially since she herself was so often dismissed as a writer because of her sex. In Chava's archives at the University of Toronto, there is a large folder containing all her rejection letters, and I do mean a large folder. She kept them all. Mostly these are letters from British, American, and Canadian publishers. Given the dismissive tone of some of the letters, it is hard not to suspect that Chava's sex, as well as her Jewish subject matter, were behind some of the comments. For instance, on rejecting the Tree of Life for publication in English, an editor wrote, and I quote, "One thing is certain, whoever publishes the Tree of Life, however much he believes in it, will be taking on an enormous burden. Do you actually understand this?" That's the end of the quote, as if she were a 5-year-old child. Even friendlier comments in the Yiddish press betrayed the sexism of the times. For instance, when Chava's play, The Bird of the Ghetto, was being prepared for performance by the Habima, Israel's national theater, the local Montreal Yiddish newspaper wrote, and I quote, "The wife of a Montreal Jewish doctor and the mother of growing children, one of the highly regarded poets in Yiddish literature, has had her drama, The Bird of the Ghetto, accepted for presentation by Israel's National Theater, the Habima." That's the end of the quote. You'll notice that the hierarchy of importance goes from her being the wife of a doctor, then a mother of growing children, and lastly, a highly regarded poet. When Chava's friend and good friend, the well-known Yiddish writer Melech Ravitch, tried to raise funds for the Yiddish publication of the Tree of Life, he wrote that the book was written, and again I quote, "It was written with an iron-willed self-discipline and Homeric sweep that is amazing in a woman writer. The more so since there is not a trace of hysteria in the writing." That's the end of the quote. Personally, I've never been able to shake the suspicion that Chava is not better known, even today, as a writer about the Holocaust because she was a woman. Because of her experiences with sexism, Chava was particularly sympathetic to other Jewish women writers. And that's just a second. Sorry about that. The other Jewish women writers, and often sought them out. However, the woman writer she was closest to was her fellow lodger and childhood friend, the Swedish novelist Zhenya Larsson, née Marcinkowska, with whom she kept up a lifelong correspondence. The two women were a year apart in age. When they were girls in Łódź, both harbored literary ambitions. So it is no surprise that after the war, they both became writers. As girls, Chava wrote poetry in Yiddish, Zhenya wrote prose in Polish. Unlike Chava, Zhenya never went to a Yiddish language school, so she was more comfortable speaking and writing in Polish, and their correspondence after the war was carried on in this language as well, even when they were both in their 70s and struggled to remember the Polish language that neither had heard nor spoken since they were young. Bergen Belsen looms large in their joint story because this is where the two friends who had been inseparable throughout the war parted. After going through the deprivations of the Lodz Ghetto together, after surviving Auschwitz and the forced labor camp at Segal, and finally, after living through the unspeakable horrors of Bergen Belsen, where they were left to die, Zhenya decided to leave Chava and Chava's family and accept an offer of refuge from the Swedish government. The two friends would not meet again for another 20-odd years. In the meantime, they wrote letters. The first 25 years of their correspondence will be published next month by McGill-Queens University Press in English translation. The book is called Letters from the Afterlife, and it deals with the two women novelists' adjustment to life after the Holocaust, as they each struggled to adapt to new languages and new countries, while processing the horror of what had happened to them during the war. As you can see, if you're ordering from the UK, there is a discount. If you're ordering from North America, the publisher didn't tell me anything about that. I'm sure there is a discount too. And just please get in touch with me and I'll arrange for it. Finally, I cannot end without mentioning an event that took place nearly 2 years ago in October 2023. It was a happy event, and so I'd like to end with that, because in that year, the city of Łódź hosted 4 days of festivities in order of Chava Rosenfarb's centennial, a rare honor for a Canadian writer, let alone a Jewish one. They also named the year itself after Chava. They hosted walking tours, especially of the Lodz Ghetto, where Chava had been incarcerated. There were lectures and concerts throughout the year, culminating in an international literary conference held at the University of Lodz to commemorate Chava's work and the work of other Jewish women writers. The part of the city where the ghetto had once stood was festooned with murals and wall drawings of Chava's face and lines from her poetry. So I cannot think of a more fitting way to end this talk than by showing off these slides of the murals. I have not said a word about Yiddish itself, so I will have to leave that for another time because I am out of time. I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Goldie. That was really fascinating and wide-ranging. And I'll try, for the audience, I'll try and get the code and put that in the chat as well for the 30% discount, which is very good. And I've also put a link to our exhibition page. But yes, if anyone in the audience have any questions or anything else, if you could put them in the chat. And yeah, could you I have got one that's come through in the Q&A, but I probably prefer if people use the chat actually. But we've got a message saying, just asking if you could say a bit more about what Chava wrote about the unspeakable horrors of Bergen Belsen.
I'm in the middle. This is the last part of this is the novel. I don't know if people can see it. So it's a big book. And I'm just my marker shows where I am in the text. I'm finishing it. Basically it's it describes really the focus, there's a heroine, only one this time, and she ends up at Bergen Belsen. They are pretty much dumped there, and the part that I have just translated is the march from the women were building. They were in a forced labor camp at what in real life was Zazel. It has another name in the book. And they sense that the war is coming to an end, and they all get excited, and they watch their capos. And the capos start behaving strangely, and the capos lead them on a forced march down to Bergen Belsen. And then basically, once they get into the camp, they desert them. There's no food. And the section I've just translated is about the description of the barracks, which are filthy, and where they are pretty much, there are piles of corpses everywhere. I did publish a section of this book in the Montreal Gazette many years ago, and so I know it's not where I have that there are descriptions of cannibalism in the camp. It's really quite horrific, and because just a personal note, because it is so difficult, it has been so difficult because even the section on Auschwitz, I have been very slow about translating this novel because I find it difficult to read and of course to translate it as well. I have been working on it for quite a number of years. I'm towards the end. I will finish it, but I don't want to say more than what I've just said.
Okay, yes, thank you, Goldie. That makes complete sense, and also that obviously it can be difficult enough to read things about Nazi camps and so on without actually thinking of a family member a close family member having had to live through that as well is an extra complication. But you've chosen to focus on and translate a lot of your mother's work, and could you tell us a bit more about what has led you to do that? And just actually, sorry, before that, just to say, I think we'd left the chat disabled, but it should now allow you to I think I've changed the settings. You can now send Goldie and I questions in the chat. So yes, if perhaps you could say something about what led you, Goldie, to focus on your mother's work in this way.
Well, she She sent me to translating when I was very young. My first translation, I was 14, and I was bedridden with a back. I'd had an operation on my back, and she came in and asked me to translate her play, the Bird of the Ghetto. And it was a terrible translation. My English was not that great because Yiddish was my first language, and I really, when I read it many years later, I was so embarrassed. In any case, she always wanted me to translate. She translated herself also into English. And she tried to get it published. She sent her translations everywhere. The problem was that while her spoken English was excellent, writing is a different animal. And so she needed help from someone who had a certain facility with English, which I eventually acquired. So she was always asking me to translate. And when I was younger, I didn't want to do it. And it took a long time. I was in my mid-30s before my mother asked me again, because finally the Tree of Life was going to be published in Australia. But the publisher had said, we will publish this, but you need to fix the English text. And so she asked me again if I would help her. And at that time, I agreed. And that was really my first introduction to my mother's work and to what kind of novelist she was. I mean, it took my breath away. It just completely changed the way I understood my relationship to her. I was just so full of respect for her. But the problem was, at the same time, I was working on my dissertation. And I eventually got a job teaching English literature. And it was hard for me to balance the two. So I did translate in between on summers and things like that. But it took a long time before really until I could retire. That once I retired, I decided I would devote my retirement to publicizing my mother and to translating her work.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much. That's great. So we've got a few interesting questions that are coming in. So from George, thank you for the talk and saying, could you tell us more about the relationship between autobiography and fiction within the Tree of Life? He'd like to understand a bit more about how Chava herself might have thought about the relationship between the historical record and her experiences.
That's a wonderful question. That is a wonderful question. I could go on for a long time. So I'll try to make it short. Basically, when my mother was older, I begged her to write down her autobiography so that I would know after she was gone what was real, what was true, what was not. She got about 10 pages into it and she said, I can't do it. All my life is in my books, right? That is who I am. So in the Tree of Life, there is one of the 10 heroines is a schoolgirl called Rachel Ibushitz, and she is clearly the alter ego for my mother. In this last novel, which is focused only on one heroine, that heroine is also clearly based on my mother. But I have no way of knowing what actually happened and what didn't, except the generally. So in Letters to Russia, there's a scene in Auschwitz. And that was a huge eye-opener because I imagined that actually had happened. So it's fictionalized. And in the Tree of Life, you have 10 characters, male characters, female characters from all walks of life. So all of them are not representations of my mother, right? They can't be alter egos, but they are her attempt to imagine herself into other people. So the factual basis of her novels, she did research, and the factual basis, I'm pretty sure, is correct. But the fictional basis, I doubt that there were characters, that she knew actual people of the kind that she describes some of them so well, so vividly. It's really, it's the some people cannot write nonfiction. They have to write fiction. And my guy, Charles Dickens, was another one who had a lot of trouble writing a factual autobiography, but he wrote about himself fictionally. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. And just a comment from Ben on the Tree of Life, saying thanks to you and your mother for bringing him the incomparable literary masterpiece that is the Tree of Life. So that's good to hear. And there's more thanks for your talk. Also from Alexis, thank you for the translations, and from Ulla asking about translation. So what do you find most challenging about translating your mother's novels? Her short stories are so incredibly powerful, and Ulla's noticed, oh, I keep losing the rest of the comment, hang on. Some of the English translations, such as A Letter to God, this isn't letting me see it very well, hang on. See if I can pop it out and see it better. We'll perhaps answer the first bit of the question while I try and locate the second bit of the question, which is, what do you find most challenging about the translations?
Well, as I said, right now with Letters to Abrasha, the last novel, what I'm finding really challenging is not getting upset by what I'm reading and putting into English. It is, because my mother's such a powerful writer, it's hard not to go to bed with images from what she has written. So emotionally, I find that quite difficult. In terms of the language itself, of going from Yiddish to English, I guess what I would say, my mother and I used to have horrible fights, screaming fights with doors banging and walking out and so on, because over translation, because she knew English very well. She read constantly. And if I said, you cannot say that, she would say, I want to say this, and it's correct. And I would sometimes say to her, it's too mushy. It's too sentimental. You can't say that like that in English. Too many adjectives, too much. And I think that is the difference, right? Yiddish is a very emotional language. It's built into the language, and it's hard. And she wanted to translate it that way. And to my ear, once I got you, I mean, I lived in an English-speaking environment. It sounded wrong, not because it was necessarily grammatically wrong, but because I felt that the emotion behind it was wrong. I don't know if that makes any sense. So I found that very difficult to sort of cool down the text a bit, especially in certain parts of the fictions. And otherwise, I mean, the problems are the same as all translators have, right? There are expressions in Yiddish that don't have equivalents in English. A lot of them, religious expressions that really there are no equivalents. So you have to think of something that is close, but not the same, right? No cigar. And so that kind of thing, but I think all translators from all languages have to deal with that. So that's what I would say.
But it sounds as if between English and Yiddish, there's maybe a bigger difference, almost as a kind of novelistic idiom or something, compared to maybe some languages.
Yes, I think Yiddish is a very it's also been described as a cloying language, very sentimental. People who don't know Yiddish very well will sometimes come out with all these, there's a lot of diminutives, and there's several kinds of diminutives. Like I said, it borrows from Polish, it borrows from German. So my name, my mother called me when she was mad at me, Golda. When she loved me, she called me Goldele, Goldush, Goldishi, right? That kind of evolution with names, for instance, and each change denotes another kind of emotion, and that is almost impossible to get into English because you don't have that. You have diminutives in English, but it doesn't mean the same. Like, it doesn't come across in the same way. I think that's what I meant by they're translating the emotionality of the language.
Yes, yes. And talking about her language, there's a question from Lee about her poetic voice and asking if you could say more about Chava's poetic voice and whether she preserved it in her prose works. Was it Homeric in her writing? What was Homeric in her writing, as you mentioned, and how did you convey that as a translator?
So the Homeric adjective is not mine. It's Melech-Ravitch, right? He was Melech-Ravitch was a big figure in Yiddish literature, and he was trying to raise money for for the Tree of Life because it's 3 volumes and it's very expensive. So he sent around like a little blurb to various Jewish communities in the world. And this was his way of pushing the book, right? He called it Homeric. I think what he meant was that it's an epic, and that is fair, right? It is an epic. It's 3 volumes. Each volume concentrates on a year or 2 years, and there are 10 characters, and it moves through history. Somebody asked me about the relationship between fiction and history. Some of the characters are historical. For instance, Rimkovsky, he is there in his with his own name, but my mother goes inside his head, right, trying to imagine what he thought. So, and I think I've just lost. Oh, so what is Homeric about the poetic voice? So yes, she wrote. Her style in Yiddish is very often to be poetic. There is a section in the Tree of Life. It's absolutely horrific once you realize what's being described. There's a number of sections like that, like people being thrown from a hospital, patients, and she describes how they fall like angels because they have white gowns on. And it, in a sense, it sort of the poetry underlines the horror of what you're reading. But the section I was going to mention, which is I really have no words to explain to say how impressive I found this. At the same time, it's absolutely horrible. It is about a man who has been tortured at the police station, and you don't see the man. What you see are the ants that crawl on his body, and the ants are like Jews, right? They're crawling all over his body, and until finally they fall into the abyss between his legs, which tells you he's been castrated, and there's blood everywhere. So the horror of what she is describing is filtered through this description of ants, which starts out very innocently. At first, there are all these ants, and they're crawling, and you realize they're crawling on a human body, and then they fall into the abyss. So, I mean, I guess to me that is poetic. It's using poetry to both underline the horror of what you are reading and also to obfuscate it to some extent. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, I think it definitely does. And then June is asking how you feel about recent Holocaust books, like I guess fiction, works of fiction that are not by survivors, but maybe imagining what life must have been like in concentration camps. So I imagine in Canada, there's also been a sequence of the XYZ of Auschwitz or whatever, all these types of popular novels, or sometimes popular histories, I suppose. But I think the question makes more sense thinking about fictionalized accounts.
I to tell you the truth, I don't read them, and I don't want to read them. I first of all, I have Holocaust enough with my mother's So when I read for pleasure, that's not where I go. Um, it also annoys me. And I read the reviews of some of these books, like the boy in the striped pajamas, and books like that, and the tattooist of Auschwitz, which I have read pretty much dismissive reviews. So if the reviews are bad, and I tend to read reviews a lot, I won't go near the book. But I think even if there was a book that got a lot of praise, for instance, there have been quite a few novels about the Lodz Ghetto, written by people who were not there. There was a Swedish one, written by a Swedish novelist a few years ago about Rumkowski. I guess I don't really want to read them. I worry that people start to, in a sense, romanticize the Holocaust. It makes me very nervous. And so I tend to stay away from that.
Yes, understandable. So we're slightly running out of time, but just one more question from George, asking about if you can tell us more about Chava's involvement in the writing group in Łódź, and did she continue to participate in anything like this writing community after the war?
Did she continue to participate? Well, she had a writing community in Montreal, right? I mean, as soon as she arrived, she was treated like royalty. The people came in the middle of a snowstorm to welcome her to the city. She came by train with my father, and she was pregnant with me, and so in Montreal, for as long as these writers lived, she had a literary community. And she, as I mentioned, she often spoke at the Jewish Public Library in Yiddish, right? So these were all Yiddish speakers. In Lodz, she was very young, and she was introduced to the writing community. It's amazing that there was a writing community in Lodz. She describes this, a writers group in the Tree of Life. She describes it in quite a lot of detail. She got introduced to it. She showed her poems to the man who ran one of the workshops. And it just so happened that the poet, Simcha Bunim Shayevich, was there at the time, and he read her poetry, and he became her mentor. He was a well-known poet before the war. Unfortunately, only 2 of his poems have survived, but he, I think it's not a secret, he fell in love with her, and he mentored her. She always called him my mentor. She has a wonderful essay about him, which is available online and also in the book of essays about him, and he appears as a character in the Tree of Life under the name of Simcha Bunim Berkovich. But so he introduced her to this writers group, which was made up mostly of older writers, some of whom had a big name from before the war, like what's her name, Miriam Ulinover. And she describes this group in great detail. They're also painters. The man who is on the cover of the Tree of Life holding a portfolio is Israel Lazarovich, who was a ghetto painter. So that entire cultural group is described in great detail in the Tree of Life. I don't know what more I could say about that group. You have to read the book.
Yes, definitely. Okay, well, thank you so much, Goldie, for a wonderful talk. And as you can see in the chat, there's a lot of appreciation for it and for your work and for Chava's work as well. So thanks so much for giving your time, and to the audience for coming and for some great questions, and hope to see you all at future in-person or online Wiener Holocaust Library events. The talk has been recorded, and at some point in the next couple of days will be available on our YouTube channel. So thank you, everybody, and good night. Or good night if you're in Britain, or good evening. I don't know. From Goldie, it's probably, what time is it with you?
It's about 12:30.
Right, so I don't know what you said. Good day. Okay, bye, everybody.
Bye. Barbara, are you staying on?